War. War never changes.
You some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to this week's episode, the 1972 Easter Offensive. This began on 30 March of 1972 when the People's Army of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, PAVN, whatever, launched a conventional attack against South Vietnam. And unlike the predominantly guerrilla operations associated with earlier phases of the war, they used infantry, tanks, artillery, got the engineers out there, and a lot of logistical support in a highly coordinated conventional campaign. 120,000 North Vietnamese troops participated in the offensive, with hundreds of tanks and an equal number of artillery pieces. The offensive had three principal axes: the Quang Tri province in northern South Vietnam, the Central Highlands around Kon Tum, and Binh Long province around An Loc. Additional attacks occurred elsewhere to disrupt South Vietnamese reinforcement and prevent the concentration of reserves. The northern attack was the largest initial operation. NVA forces crossed the DMZ and advanced south through Quang Tri province. The principal attacking forces had elements of several different divisions with tanks and heavy artillery, T-54s, T-55s, PT-76s that were supplied generously not just by China, their primary sponsor, but also by the Soviet Union. And this provided the offensive with a level of armored capability not seen at this scale in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese First Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Hong Dong Lam, whatever, dude, I'm doing my best, initially faced the assault with one division, the 3rd, and some Marine units, Rangers, and territorial forces. Forward fire bases were subjected to prolonged artillery attacks before eventually being overrun or simply abandoned. The NVA advance rapidly captured positions along the northern approaches to Quang Tri City. The withdrawal of South Vietnamese forces became increasingly disorganized. Thousands of civilians moved south along Highway 1, creating congestion that complicated military movements. By early May, NVA forces had captured Quang Tri City. The loss of the city was a huge blow to the South Vietnamese army and created a serious political problem for President Nguyen Van Thu's government. The South Vietnamese government subsequently reorganized its forces in I Corps. Lieutenant General No Quang Trong replaced General Lam as commander. Trong concentrated Marine, Airborne, Ranger, and other elite formations to establish a new defensive line just south of the Mai Chan River. American naval gunfire and extensive air support were integral in the defense. In the Central Highlands, PAVN forces attacked towards Kon Tum. The offensive sought to capture the key terrain and threaten the South Vietnamese communication network and really just sever the very narrow country. The principal target was Kon Tum City. NVA forces advanced using, again, infantry and artillery and armor. The South Vietnamese defenders included elements of the 22nd and 23rd Infantry Divisions, and the defense was reinforced as the threat developed. American advisors played an important role in coordinating air support, and let's be quite honest, in the defense of Kon Tum City, an American civilian effectively commanded. So John Paul Vann was a lieutenant colonel who got out, retired, was an outspoken critic and someone who ruffled a lot of feathers. So his career didn't go well. He then became part of USAID, returned to Vietnam as a civilian advisor, and he was the de facto commander of the 2 Corps defense of Kon Tum City during this fight, specifically coordinating the air support and reorganizing the defenses. For this, as a civilian, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and then later received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He is the only civilian in Vietnam to receive the Distinguished Service Cross. He died shortly after the attack in a helicopter crash that had nothing to do with combat operations. So interesting figure. There's a book, A Bright and Shining Lie, where he figures prominently. So an interesting little side note on that, on the 2 Corps defense. And then the third major offensive developed around An Loc in Binh Long province to the south. The NVA forces advanced from their bases in Cambodia and northern Binh Long with the objective of capturing An Loc, which wanted to threaten Saigon from the northwest. It was defended by the ARVN 5th Infantry Division with, again, the same airborne and ranger units in support. The attacking forces surrounded the city and severed its principal ground communications. NVA artillery then shelled the defenders and the city, while infantry and tanks conducted repeated assaults. The first armored attacks demonstrated the strengths and weaknesses of the NVA combined arms operations. Tanks provided substantial firepower and mobility, but their movements were restricted by the urban environment and exposed to short-range South Vietnamese anti-tank weapons. The ARVN, which is the Army of Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese Army, they used recoilless rifles, M72 Laws, like I said, short-range weapons that could take out tanks in an urban environment. Because ground communications with An Loc were largely cut, American aircraft became essential for sustaining the garrison. Transport aircraft delivered supplies by parachute, and tactical aircraft provided the close air support. Helicopters were used when conditions permitted, and B-52 strikes were directed against the NVA forces throughout all three of the major attacks. This battle went on for like 3 months. The NVA forces repeatedly attempted to penetrate the city to destroy the defensive perimeter, but by June the siege had been broken and South Vietnamese forces had regained control of the approaches to An Loc. A couple key factors here. One, American air power was central to the outcome of all three major battles. The South Vietnamese army did the bulk of the fighting on the ground, but it was with the support of the American aviation that allowed them to break the conventional North Vietnamese attack. Aircraft operated from bases in South Vietnam, Thailand, and aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin. On 6th of April, the United States began Operation Linebacker, which expanded air attacks against North Vietnam. Campaign targeted transportation networks, bridges, railways, petroleum facilities, storage areas, military installations, and started using more precision-guided weapons. So the name linebacker, it's kind of literally filling in the gaps of the defensive line of the South Vietnamese army. It's kind of the origin of the name. And then this is Linebacker 1, and then Linebacker 2 happened several months later, which drove the Vietnamese to the Paris peace talks. The NVA's ability to sustain the offensive was reduced by battlefield losses and the interdiction of its logistics networks. North Vietnamese had advanced rapidly during the first weeks of the campaign, and momentum slowed as supplies became more difficult to move and replacement troops and equipment were required. The attack culminated. And there was a quite bit of variance in the different South Vietnamese forces. Some fought very, very well. Some did not. There was not a universal good or bad from the South Vietnamese army and their defensive capabilities, which is why some commanders were relieved, and replaced by American advisors and things like that. The Easter offensive resulted in very heavy casualties for the North Vietnamese, and everyone's lying about it. The NVA was loath to admit how many people they lost, but it was in the several tens of thousands, and lost nearly all the tanks and artillery that ended up crossing the border. But they did have the organizational capacity to conduct large-scale conventional warfare. So the South Vietnamese, they showed the progressive of Nixon's attempt at Vietnamization, but also the limitations in the absence of American air support. By the end of 1972, the NVA had failed to achieve its objective of destroying the South Vietnamese government, or a collapse of the Army of South Vietnam. It had captured substantial territory in the northern provinces, but failed to capture Kon Tum or An Loc. And South Vietnamese forces later in counterattacks recovered significant portions of the initial lost territory. The Easter Offensive was a major conventional military campaign, not a successful invasion. North Vietnam demonstrated capabilities, but South Vietnamese ground forces and American air support stopped them. So that's the basic story. One of the things that is hard with this podcast is I want to just give you a taste of something without the expectation that I'm going to give you the full story. I can't. And if you find the initial story interesting, well, then I encourage you to go out and learn some more about it. So what are the lessons learned, which is really the important thing here? First off, you'll hear the name Giap. He was one of the principal commanders in North Vietnam. And he's been called this military genius. As far as I can see, Giap is kind of an incompetent clown. The Tet Offensive and the Easter Offensive were both creations of Giap, and both of them failed. Whatever you hear after the fact, it's unquestioned that Giap expected both the Tet Offensive and the Easter Offensive to cause the collapse of the South Vietnamese government and reunite Vietnam under communist control. He just did not understand that he couldn't do it. And he got a lot of his forces killed in this attempt. Now, later on, they said, well, we just want to make a political statement, blah, blah, blah. Bull. No, Giap really thought militarily he could do it. And what happens is when your own forces are getting their butts kicked because your generals suck, it is tempting to say, oh, no, we don't suck. It's our enemy is amazing. And a lot of American generals spent a lot of time playing up what a genius Giap was militarily. Why? Because we sucked at what we were doing. And same thing happened with Rommel in North Africa. Rommel wasn't that good. He was a good leader. His troops liked him. He was able to get his forces to do something. But at the strategic level, he failed. Rommel's job in North Africa was to delay the Americans and British from getting involved in Europe so that Hitler could concentrate his forces and defeat the Soviet Union. It was an economy of force delaying action. If Rommel had not tried to take Alexandria or Cairo, which was never in the cards, he never had the logistical support to do it, he wouldn't have culminated right after the fall of Tobruk and been effectively counterattacked by Montgomery out of Egypt and, of course, the United States landing in Casablanca. He could have kept the game going for a lot longer. And he's constantly complaining, I need more of this, I need more of that. A smart general realizes where he's at and don't ask for things that aren't on the table. The main effort for the Nazis at that time was, of course, the war with the Soviet Union. And Rommel could have delayed, in my opinion, an extra year if he had just fought more intelligently and nested within the overall policy and strategy of Nazis. To the same degree, Giap, know your limitations. Now, some have argued that the Tet Offensive was designed to just wipe out all the leadership of the Viet Cong so that the North would have unquestioned dominance after what they saw as inevitable reunification. So, yeah, I don't have a lot of time for Giap. Yeah, they won the war, but Giap had two massive battles, which I won't say alone, but he was the primary instigator of, and they both failed in their objectives and got a lot of people killed. So I'm not impressed. Another thing to learn from this is of the three attacks, only one of them came from North Vietnam. The Central Highlands came from Laos, and then the southern attack came from Cambodia. You have to remember in the 1960s, Cambodia and Laos were both Western aligned, and North Vietnam invaded these countries to use their bases to attack South Vietnam. The fact is, if the fight in Vietnam had been confined just to South and North Vietnam, South Vietnam never would have fell. It was only their access to Cambodia and Laos through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which many people are surprised to learn the Ho Chi Minh Trail was not in Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was in Laos and Cambodia. Western aligned countries invaded by the communists so that they could carry the fight into South Vietnam, defeat the Western aligned forces there, and then, in domino strategy, then take out Laos, then take out Cambodia, all of which happened. It was only after the fall of South Vietnam that the communist forces then turned their attention to Laos and Cambodia. So, people, we talked about this earlier, people bad-mouthing domino theory. It's not a theory. It was a stated strategy that the communists affected. Capture one territory, and then when that's done, use that as a base to capture the next territory and keep on going until they're stopped. That's exactly what the communists did. And those who decried domino theory as some sort of false talking point are either idiots or communists. You can quote me on that. The United States knew the attack was coming. They had seen the buildup, and they had saw the massive forces in North Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And the political decision was made to not attack a massing force. And this goes back to one of the absolute prime considerations at the policy and strategy level. If you're going to allow your enemy to have a base where you can never touch them, the war will never end, as long as the government remains intact. So there's a lot of lessons here. If we had preemptively hit all these massed forces in Laos and Cambodia and North Vietnam with B-52 strikes, there never would have been an Easter offensive. And arguably, that would have just stopped everything that was happening. But the political pressure on Nixon was too great because a lot of people didn't want to expand the war, even though the war had already been expanded. So once you give your enemy a safe haven, it's not as if the North Vietnamese were going to say, well, we want to attack South Vietnam. It's just ridiculous, and it's frustrating. Same thing with the Taliban in Afghanistan, where they could refit in Pakistan, our great allies, Pakistan, which funded and supported the Taliban for 20 years. We paid Pakistan money that they gave to the Taliban so the Taliban could kill Americans. And we still pretend that Pakistan is our ally today. We still send their officers to our training. We still pretend there's some sort of fair arbitrator when they harbored Osama bin Laden for a decade. We invaded Afghanistan for giving safe harbor to Osama bin Laden, and then we just let him hang out in Pakistan for a decade, and we never did anything against the Pakistan government. It's all hypocrisy. It all is very frustrating and angry. So if you're going to let your enemy have a safe haven, expect defeat. Nothing should be off limits in a war. And if you can't marshal the requisite political support to engage your enemy wherever they may be, then don't get started in the war at a military, tactical, and operational level. Rather simply focus on removing the government, because it's the only way that you will have a positive outcome to the policy of your nation. Because if you can't touch their military forces, then there's no reason to attack their military forces in a half-assed manner. Either you go after the head or you leave it, which goes back to the Iran conflict, where you have the United States bombing operational tactical targets and Israel targeting the political leadership. I think Israel has the smarter strategy to affect long-term change to Iranian policy. But neither here nor there. We can see we're not making a lot of progress. Technically, the 60-day ceasefire is over now. There's all of that. And then finally, in a conventional mechanized force, the signal that comes off of tanks and Bradleys and things like that is too great for an advance, an attack to be successful in the absence of at least air control, borrowing from Corbett's sea control. You have to have enough tactical air defense to keep the enemy aircraft off your back at the point of attack. You don't have to have air supremacy. You don't have to have total control of the air, but you got to keep the enemy aircraft off your back at the key point. Not sea power, not air power, but air control, sea control in the Corbett model at that decisive point. The North Vietnamese were not able to do it, even though they did have some tactical air defense. And that's one of the great shortcomings of the American military right now. We have no tactical air defense of any sort. And drones are ubiquitous at this point. We can no longer assume complete control of the air at every point. We will have to deal with drones, and we do not have the equipment, and we certainly don't have the strategic thought that would really expand our tactical air defense capabilities in an integrated manner against these new threats. We're throwing a bunch of weird technology at it, but there's no real doctrinal or operational analysis going with it. And if we do mechanized warfare, I think we're going to suffer accordingly. The lessons of Ukraine are becoming obsolete as soon as we learn them. And all we're doing is being reactive. We have to rely both on Ukraine, on Israel, on some countries that have better experience with tactical air defense than we do. It's a huge shortcoming. As a father of soldiers and soon to be Marines who are serving, this worries me a lot. We've neglected tactical air defense. Really, we haven't shot down an enemy aircraft with air defense capabilities since the Korean War. That's a long time to go without any experience in what we're actually doing. So those are some concerns. These are kind of the lessons learned. All right, that's all I got. I'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.